Ms. Brown, good morning. Ms. Brown, good morning.
Good morning,
You are now going, I believe, briefly to make an opening statement on behalf of the Home Secretary.
Yes, thank you, sir. This opening statement is made by the Secretary of State for the Home Department, the Home Secretary, as one of the inquiry's core participants, and she represents the interests of the Home Office at this inquiry. The Home Secretary welcomes the invitation to make this statement at the outset of the Module 1, Tranche 1, Phase 3 hearings. As a core participant, the Home Secretary continues to engage fully with the work of the inquiry. In particular, and as stated in the Home Secretary's opening statements of the 22nd of October 2020 and the 14th of April 2021, the Home Office has undertaken an extensive electronic and hard copy disclosure exercise, both in response to specific requests from the inquiry and on a wider voluntary basis. Turning to the evidence and issues to be considered during the Tranche 1 Phase 3 hearings, the Home Secretary notes that the inquiry does not intend to call evidence from any Home Office witnesses. Accordingly, the Home Secretary has nothing specific to add at this stage to her previous opening statements. For present purposes, the Home Secretary would wish simply to reiterate that the inquiry has her full cooperation as a core participant.
Thank you very much. You certainly hold the record for brevity. I'm afraid we now have to wait 10 minutes before Mr. Scobie will make his opening statement to permit arrangements to be made to get everything in order to allow him to do so. So we'll break for 10 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Scobie. Are you now ready to make your opening statement? I'm afraid I can't hear you at the moment, so I hope that those who are in charge of the equipment can rectify that. Has sound been restored? No.
The technician is on his way to the room. Mr. Scobie's microphone is off.
Mr. Scobie, I hope your microphone has been restored.
It has. Can you hear me?
I can now hear you. And in the hope that the equipment doesn't go wrong again, would you like to begin your opening statement?
Of course. Thank you, sir. I appear with Piers Marquis of Doughty Street Chambers and Paul Heron of the Public Interest Law Centre. And this is the opening statement in Tranche 1, Phase 3, to the undercover policing inquiry on behalf of Lindsey German, Richard Chessum, and Mary. Introduction. We represent 3 core participants in Tranche 1 of this inquiry. We address the key issues on behalf of Richard Chessum and Mary in our Phase 2 opening statement. In this statement, our focus is on Lindsey German, who was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP, from 1972, and had roles on the Central Committee of that party for more than 30 years. We will demonstrate, 1, that there was no justification for the infiltration of the Troops Out movement and the Socialist Workers' Party on the grounds of preventing public disorder. 2, that there was no policing justification at all. The true purpose of these infiltrations was political and economic. 3, that neither of these purposes were legally justified and government knew that to be the case. 4, that the Special Demonstration Squad, the SDS intelligence, was used to blacklist law-abiding members of the public. We have a limited time available to us, and so we ask listeners to consider this opening statement alongside the written published version, which is more detailed and fully referenced. And where we refer to the unlawfulness of police activity, we endorse the legal framework provided on behalf of the Category H core participants. Purpose of the SDS justification. The SDS was created to specifically deal with the potential public order threat of a single demonstration in 1968. Its role was to provide uniformed police with intelligence pertinent to their policing of that demonstration. It should have ended there. It quickly became an intelligence trawl of left-wing political groups, growing ever more indiscriminate and ever more intrusive. Increasingly, the squad's focus shifted away from anything that could genuinely be described as police work. Suggestions that the SDS were involved in law and order are not borne out by the reports that they generated. References to disorder became standardized, annually regurgitated in the SDS reports. It was part of a paper trail pretense to justify Home Office funding and authorization. Even though, in Chief Inspector Craft's words, the SDS annual reports were exercised in pointing up the value of the SDS in terms of public order, the references to disorder in those reports were ever decreasing and increasingly contrived. The 1975 annual SDS report made so little reference to disorder that Commander Roger of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch commissioned a complete review of the SDS, its activities and objectives. Roger noted that over the past 7 years, disorder and demonstrations has dwindled considerably. The response to the review came from the Chief Superintendent of the SDS, Rollo Watts. Watts accepted the decline, but nevertheless attempted to justify the continuation of the SDS. He argued that the decline in disorder had been matched by a reduction in the number of undercover officers from 26 down to 12. That was not true. There had been no reduction in the number of officers at all. The number had remained consistent, but the lengths of the deployments had increased. At the same time that public disorder was decreasing, the recipients of SDS intelligence, or customers, as DI Angus McIntosh called them, were changing. At the outset, SDS intelligence was destined for uniformed officers so that they could arguably be better equipped to deal with disorder. Even there, as Detective Sergeant Roy Creamer put it, whilst the SDS were looking for information, there was simply nothing to tell of. It was a case of no news is good news. As time went on, the intelligence was increasingly sent elsewhere to customers with little or no involvement in public order issues. Other special branch departments, MI5, other generally unnamed government departments, external agencies, liaison partners, those customers also specifically tasked the SDS, i.e., told them what to get and where to get it. By the end of the 1970s, the SDS management were having regular face-to-face meetings with MI5, including over games of sport that are redacted for some reason. They were also having monthly meetings over lunch with the Home Office, although the name and specific role of the Home Office representative in question appears to have been forgotten. Other unnamed government bodies were not liaised with directly. It was considered more appropriate to keep them at arm's length. By April 1980, SDS and MI5 were meeting for drinks every fortnight. By August 1980, meetings were described as routine. At the same time, the volume of reports increased exponentially from 200 information reports in 1969 to almost 10,000 by November 1971, with thousands being produced on an annual basis thereafter. In all of this reporting, there is a remarkable lack of reports on public order issues. The explanation offered for this by the SDS is that the Metropolitan Police have destroyed or lost their material, and the documents that we are able to examine were sourced from MI5. It follows, they say, that the reports we can see are bound to give a skewed impression because Special Branch did not send their public order reports to MI5. That is a very convenient, risible explanation, and it does not fit with the evidence. As public disorder was declining, liaison with other agencies was increasing, along with the number of reports generated. Certainly by 1976, most of the information obtained by the SDS ultimately went to the Security Service. In relation to Lindsey German and Richard Chessum, the SDS were doing nothing concerning policing at all. They did not report on law and order. They had no regard to the law at all. They were political and economic police with echoes of the Stasi. The Socialist Workers' Party policing the National Front. First, we're going to look at the fallacy of a public order justification. Lindsey German was a member of the Central Committee of the SWP for more than 30 years. During that time, the party was by far the most infiltrated organization by the SDS. There were at least 24 SDS officers that infiltrated them. Many of those, we now know, took positions of responsibility of some sort at branch, district, or national level. They formed relationships with members that lasted for years, tricked them into friendships and sexual relationships. They entered their homes, betrayed their trust, and exploited them for intelligence purposes. We can see the intelligence that they gained in the reports. They reported on and disseminated the details of thousands of members, their personal lives, physical appearances, homes, children, finances, jobs, holiday plans, weddings, sexuality, paternity, relationship statuses, intelligence level, trade union affiliations, health, childcare arrangements, vehicles, studies, and opinions. There is a striking lack of reports on criminality, public disorder, or violence. Even in the annual reports where the SDS desperately tried to justify their continued existence, it's difficult to find a rationale. The Right to Work campaign and its annual march to the Conservative Party conference was an important and high-profile demonstration supported by the SWP and endorsed by hundreds of trade unions. In the 1980 SDS annual report, the SDS attempt to claim credit for the suggestion that small events on the route of that march were, and I quote, frustrated by advance information, close quotes, because the right to work campaign was so effectively penetrated by the SDS. In fact, their own internal report had always indicated that the march itself was not seen as a great threat to public order. In another internal report, the SDS attributed the lack of disorder on the march to the presence of local and national media. The SDS infiltration had no impact whatsoever on disorder on that march, but they presented a different picture to the Home Office. Now, whether that was for their own benefit to secure funding or the Home Offices to have a policing-related explanation to hand, should they ever need one, is not entirely clear. The SDS also attempt to claim credit for the lack of disorder at the culminating demonstration. Inevitably, there is no reference to the discussions that Lindsey German herself had with the infiltrating officer, HN80 Colin Clark, about taking steps to ensure that no one did get arrested, to ensure the safety of everyone through good stewarding. Equally, there is no reference at all to the fact that the SWP took great care in stewarding their events, and that Clark himself was an SWP steward at their national conferences. The 1981 SDS annual report makes reference to pickets, occupations, and marches as protests against unemployment and cuts in public expenditure, and the anti-Tory demonstration, the march's culmination. But it makes no reference to any disorder. Previous right-to-work campaign marches did not even feature in the annual reports. The only references to genuine disorder were in respect of processions organized by the National Front. In terms of justification, there were clearly better methods of policing that kind of disorder. One, the infiltration of the SWP does not appear to have generated any intelligence of use. In the thousands of pages of reporting on SWP activity, there is a distinct lack of anything that actually concerns public order. Some officers have been open about the fact that their reporting showed no risk. There is nothing that could not have been sourced using lawful methods of policing. Point two, any confrontations stemmed from documented, historically confirmed attacks by the far right on minorities and leftists. We highlighted some of the murders, beatings, arsons, and threats in our last statement to the inquiry. In her statement, Lindsey German highlights that in the 6 years between 1975 and 1981, 51 Black and Asian people were killed in suspected racist murders. One method of preventing disorder would have been removing the root of the risk. Police officers would have been better, police resources would have been better spent preventing and solving real politically motivated crime. There were repeated calls by the SWP and others for the police to do exactly that, but they did not. In the 1979 Special Branch Annual Report, reference is made to the murder in May 1978 of Altab Ali. The language used by the police to describe That murder is illuminating. They said, this death, though not attributable to any racialist attack, was nevertheless used by the extreme left to influence an already deteriorating situation in the Bengali community. Those words were written over a year after Altab Ali's murder. At the time they were written, there was no doubt whatsoever the murder was racially motivated. One of the suspects had told the police, if we saw a Paki, we used to have a go at them. I'd beaten up Pakis on at least 5 occasions. In September of 1978, Altab Ali's former employer, the secretary of the Brick Lane Mosque, had published a report. It was called Blood on the Streets. It detailed the number of racist attacks on the community in Brick Lane in just the first 4 months of 1978. There were 33. It listed hammer attacks, stabbings, punctured lungs, slashed faces, air gun shot wounds, people beaten with bricks and sticks and knocked unconscious in broad daylight. But the police denied racial motivation, even when it had been confessed. They then suggested that the terror in local communities was somehow the fault of left-wing activists. If there's going to be infiltration, why were the National Front not infiltrated? There has been a suggestion that Special Branch already had excellent sources in the far right. They clearly did not. Any sources that they did have were not doing a very good job of preventing the almost daily disorder and violence the National Front and their ilk were perpetrating on London streets. Certainly in 1975, the SDS knew that most of the public order problems were concerned with the activities of the National Front. Special Branch knew that National Front members were responsible for several brutal attacks on members of ethnic minorities. And they knew that this brutality heightened opposition to them. SDS officers experienced the National Front violence themselves, although we rarely see it reported. The recent evidence of HN21 emphasizes the point. He said, you would be selling the papers, and then suddenly, from out of the blue, some National Front or National Party people would turn up and try and have a go at you physically. I had a fight with someone who was trying to attack me. They were quite big, and some of us were puny characters. So it wasn't in our interest to confront them physically. From the SWP side, it was mostly shouting. From the far right thing, it was mostly physical violence. But there was no infiltration. D.I. Angus McIntosh, HN244, recalls there was a high-level policy decision not to infiltrate the far right. A policy decision is the only explanation that makes sense. What was that policy? Far-right demonstrations were deliberately provocative of violence by their very nature. They targeted minority areas with as large a show of force as they could muster. The same minority areas they were targeting with extreme levels of politically motivated violence. There is no justification for the violations of individual rights perpetrated by the SDS. But at least if they were infiltrating a political organization as criminally violent as the National Front, they might have an argument that their work was in some way connected to policing. Listening to the communities themselves, they were frightened, as well they might be. The National Front was an avowedly Nazi party. The people of Southall, Lewisham, and Wood Green did not want their community cohesion fractured by fascist demonstrations. They called for bans or at least relocation. They were ignored. The SDS annual reports of 1981 and 82 note that confrontations with the far right did not happen in those years. On both occasions, the SDS put that down to the commissioner banning National Front processions because they were deliberately provocative of disorder and violence. They always had been. The National Front marches in Southall, Lewisham and Wood Green were all deliberately provocative of disorder and violence. Surely Special Branch's excellent sources could have pointed out the inherently obvious. If police had listened to the communities they were supposed to be serving, the disorder at Southall and Lewisham would never have happened. Instead, they are used as excuses for the wholesale infiltration of the SWP. The Metropolitan Police themselves contributed to or caused public disorder at demonstrations. The only SDS report on the Lewisham disorder was retrospective and highly critical of policing methods. At Southall, the National Council of Civil Liberties were also highly critical of policing methods. One undercover officer, HN 41, was warned off attending the Southall demonstration by his managers. His explanation for this warning was that the uniformed police were going to clamp down on the demonstrations, and the dangers would be more than normal. The pre-planned dangerous clampdown would explain the account of former SWP member Joan Rudder. She had been helping injured demonstrators when she was ordered out of a house and made to run a gauntlet of police officers who beat her until her head split open. At Red Lion Square, Lindsey witnessed police officers throwing demonstrators over railings onto an underpass. At both Southall and Red Lion Square, police actions caused the deaths of demonstrators. The World in Action documentary of the Right to Work campaign march in 1980 demonstrates the issue. The marchers travelled the length of the country with a low-key police escort. The exchange between the marchers and that escort was good-natured and even jovial. The SDS report on this march had listed the time and place of the arrival in London and made it clear that there was no public order concerns. But when the march arrived in Southall, it was met by a legion of police. They flanked the roads in the same way that they had done 2 years before on the day they killed Blair Peach. Finally, it was understood that the police were doing nothing about far-right violence and disorder, or were complicit in it. That was not paranoid or imagined. It is not just racist language evident in some of the reporting, or the widespread perception the police protected the National Front, or the massively disproportionate stops and searches of young black people, or the subsequent findings of institutionalized racism in the police. One of the most interesting documents to have been disclosed in this phase deals with the Chief Superintendent of Special Branch directing 2 senior SDS officers, DI Ribby Wilson and HN 332, to meet with Lady Jane Birdwood at her home in 1968. Lady Birdwood was described as politically well-informed and well-known to Special Branch for her anti-communist views and activities. The SDS officers thanked for her interests and asked her to pass on any information that she or her friends with similar interests may have. Lady Birdwood and her friends were far-right activists and well known as such at the time. She was a racist and an anti-Semite She became periodically associated with the National Front, the British Movement, and the British National Party, stood as a far-right candidate in 3 elections, and was later convicted for multiple offences of inciting racial hatred. Why infiltrate the far right if you can have tea with your excellent sources on their lawn? It is apparent that nothing was done about the far right violence. It was almost as if there was a reason for not doing anything. A divided society is useful to the establishment, even at the expense of public order. Historically, far-right movements prosper at times of economic crisis. Immigrants are blamed for unemployment, and that is a distraction from the failing policies of government. What is never mentioned in the SDS annual reports is the SWP emphasis on positive methods of undermining fascists. Everyday local activity to protect minorities and themselves. The organization of estate residents to paint out NF graffiti, set up telephone links for mutual support and warnings against racist attacks, organizing a protection rota to protect minority residents. And then there is Rock Against Racism that the SWP had a crucial role in. That did more to unite people and prevent disorder and violence on the streets than the SDS ever did. The joint leader of the National Front admitted that it had been effectively destroyed by the campaigns of the Anti-Nazi League, again contributed to by the SWP. There was no anti-government or anti-state disorder. There was nothing that could have been said to have been violent subversion or revolutionary violence. Public order issues and the troops out movement. We dealt with public disorder issues in respect of Richard Chessum and the troops out movement in our last opening statement. Quite simply, there were none. The undercover officers and their management do not even pretend that there were any public order concerns. Political and economic policing, the real rationale. So what was the real rationale? The SDS was a part of Special Branch. Their roles and motivations are inseparable. The role of Special Branch was reviewed in 1970 by what were called terms of reference, described as originating from the Home Office and prepared in collaboration with the Security Service and other interested parties. The function of Special Branch was to gather intelligence secretly and overtly for 2 purposes. The first of those was easily justifiable from a policing perspective, to assist in preserving public order, which was a police function. The second was assisting the Security Service in 2 identified roles. A, in respect of espionage and sabotage, which again were clearly relatable to police functions, as both are covered by the criminal law, and B, more pertinently, as far as this inquiry is concerned, from actions of persons and organizations which may be judged to be subversive of the security of the state. The specific tasks of the branch included consultation with the Security Service to collect, process, and record information about subversive or potentially subversive organizations and individuals. The terms were accompanied by an annex, which clearly instructed senior officers that it was important that special branches should have a clear idea of what constitutes persons and organizations which may be judged to be subversive of the security of the state. However, they then failed to provide those senior officers and their special branches with any definitive idea of what subversive actually meant. This may have been the source of some discomfort for chief constables, because ill-defined MI5 lackey work is not what the police are supposed to be about. However, a good officer, conscious of the principles of policing, could interpret the terms consistently with special branches' pre-existing responsibility, which was the prevention of crimes directed against the state. That responsibility, preventing crime, was also enshrined in the legal definition of subversion, widely published, accepted, and acknowledged from 1963, when Lord Denning had reported on the roles of MI5 and Special Branch after his inquiry into the Profumo affair. Subversives are those who would contemplate the overthrow of the government by unlawful means. That definition is clear. It speaks very obviously of the overthrow of the body appointed from those elected by the mandate of the people. And it poses no difficulty for a police officer, because from a policing perspective, what is unlawful and what is not is defined by the criminal law. Applying that definition to the terms, police officers can still do their work professionally. They can collect and record information about potentially criminal organizations and individuals, or investigate criminal backgrounds to demonstrations or industrial disputes. All of those activities had to be conducted within the limits on police powers imposed by the law. What they cannot do is pry into political opinions and private conduct, because, as Lord Denning said, that would be in the nature of a Gestapo or secret police. Unfortunately, because the terms were deliberately opaque, officers were encouraged to be flexible in their interpretation of subversion. The security service certainly considered themselves to have an unfettered discretion to define it as they wished. And in 1972, MI5 unilaterally redefined it. Subversion became activities threatening the safety or well-being of the state and intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. That definition is very different. It prioritizes the well-being of the state, which of course is not democratically elected. It could arguably encompass any democratic movement which seeks to amend the basis of democracy or change the established order. But most importantly, from a policing perspective, it no longer makes reference to the law. Violent means are well covered by the criminal law, but political and industrial means are not. Because the terms do not include a definition and were not adapted to compensate for the whims of the security service, the police were now encouraged to depart entirely from the basic principles that underpin policing, to covertly collect information about individuals who were simply potentially subversive, people who the police knew had no involvement whatsoever in any kind of unlawful conduct. The security service have attempted to add some legitimacy to their unilateral redefinition by referring to it as the Harris definition, formally adopted by Lord Harris of Greenwich, Minister of State at the Home Office, in a debate in the House of Lords on the 26th of February, 1975. What they neglect to mention is that they had briefed Lord Harris with that definition in advance of that debate. his assertion that this definition was generally regarded as appropriate actually means nothing more than this is how MI5 defines it. But MI5 cannot change the law. Having a lord repeat a brief definition in a debate does not change the law. In fact, Lord Harris had continued his speech with an implicit endorsement of the Lord Denning definition. It is fundamental to our democratic traditions that people should be free to join together, to express and further their views, whatever others may think of those views, provided they do not break the law. That reiteration of fundamental policing principles has been comprehensively ignored. The clear shift in the activity of the SDS in terms of their customers and reporting coincided with the introduction of the MI5 definition, read alongside the 1970 terms, and then the selective forced legitimacy of a Lord's debate. Policing public order became policing the political, like Richard Chessum and the Troops Out movement, and the political and industrial, like Lindsey German and the Socialist Workers' Party. The Home Office and Security Service expanded police powers without democratic or electoral scrutiny and without any regard to the law. It's worth noting that in the course of the Lords' debate, 4 of the speaking Lords described themselves as subversive, forcefully pointing out that revolution need not be violent. Almost anybody could be described as potentially subversive. The police could and did pry into the political opinions and private conduct of law-abiding citizens, doing away with our freedom of political thought and association, of free assembly and expression. These were the secret police that Lord Denning spoke of. This was the reason why government was so terrified of the people finding out about the SDS. The correspondence that accompanies every SDS annual report emphasizes the Home Office's constant need for reassurance about security, avoiding embarrassment, and the political sensitivity of their continued funding of this Stasi-like unit. Government knowledge. The Home Office documents provided in this phase of the inquiry show the extent of their collusion with the security service, the hidden cogs of the state maneuvering, the duplicity, the avoidance of accountability, and the creation of a veil of plausible deniability. They encouraged the considerable increase in the size and responsibility of special branches in the 1970s. Special branches that, working with MI5, were more heavily involved in those aspects of their duties, which are more sensitive politically, i.e., spying on innocent people. They were particularly concerned about criticism from within Parliament and from investigative journalists that special branches were over-secretive and under-accountable and interest themselves in and record the activities of people who are merely undertaking proper political or industrial activity. It is interesting that the members of Parliament and journalists that they were concerned about had no idea of what was really going on. The criticism and public outrage came from incidents such as police taking photographs of demonstrators, or asking an arrested student to be an informant, or carrying out checks on Aeroflot passengers. This was nothing compared to what the Home Office were actually funding the SDS to do. The Home Office's first inclination in response to those legitimate concerns was to lie about it, saying it may be possible to discount much of this criticism as either misguided or mischievous. while knowing that not only was it all true, but they were signing off secret authorities for SDS officers to do far, far worse. We asked the inquirer to be conscious of this level of duplicity when engaging with government about their authorization of the SDS. A number of senior police officers were distinctly unhappy about what they were being told to do. In 1974, Commander Gilbert was of the view that, for the most part, work done for MI5 had little or no relevance to SB's proper charter and tied up staff, of which he was chronically short, in totally unproductive activity. Chief constables raised concerns that MI5 sought more intelligence from special branches than they needed. The work they were doing for MI5 was damaging police relations with the public. Most importantly, the chief constables had no idea whether there was even ministerial approval of or authority for the work that they had been doing on behalf of MI5 for the past 10 years. They knew the terms, the MI5 definition, and the artifice of the 1975 Lords debate did not constitute lawful authority in a democracy. And they knew that no minister would be willing to formally put their name to this. When the Home Office concede in internal documents that there is not a watertight basis on which to justify the work of police officers in investigating and recording the activities of subversives, what they mean is it is not lawful. The Home Office knew that there was no justification. They asked themselves the question, how can the work of police officers, which all members of special branches are, in investigating subversion as currently defined, be justified, given that the definition covers some activities which are not, as such, unlawful? But they could not answer it. There was no legal justification. And of course, they were only referring to what Special Branch was doing. The anti-democratic incursions of the SDS were far more invidious. The Home Office attempted to retrospectively legitimize Special Branch activity by reformulating the terms, but they failed. Ultimately, the Security Service blocked any attempt to update or amend them. A more honest and straightforward way of having police investigate the activities of political and industrial activists would have been to pinpoint the behavior that government was concerned about and attempt to legislate, to criminalize it as appropriate. But of course, that could never have happened, fundamentally because the activists were not doing anything wrong. Parliament and the people would not have stood for the criminalization of their fundamental rights. So the government orchestrated the increased police powers by guile and duplicity, unlawfully and anti-democratically. It is a sad irony that government activity was far more proximate to Lord Denning's definition of subversion than any of the organizations that the SDS infiltrated. In passing, to suggest that knowledge stopped at the Home Office and went no higher is beyond comprehension. In our Phase 2 opening statement, we stress the links between SDS sign-offs and Ted Heath and Harold Wilson. James Callaghan had been the Home Secretary who presided over the inception of the SDS in 1968. He had personal meetings with Conrad Dixon and was well aware of the SDS remit. One of his last acts as Home Secretary in 1970 was to oversee the introduction of the terms of reference. It is not credible to suggest that when he was Prime Minister between 1976 and 1979, he did not check on the progress of his two creations. Equally, it would be stretching credibility to suggest that prime ministerial knowledge ended in 1979 with Margaret Thatcher. Undoubtedly, the civil servants wringing their hands about illegality of special branch activity, such as Sir Robert Armstrong, Sir James Waddell, R.J. Andrew, and David Heaton, were the same civil servants signing off the funding for the SDS, firmly reminding the SDS managers of the need for security. The impact. The SWP was an open, democratic centralist organization that held predominantly open and publicized meetings. It had an open membership and a democratically elected structure with positions of responsibility open to all members. It published its aims, campaigns, and political theories in an open way. The Metropolitan Police even had subscriptions to the publications. Those theories were socialist and revolutionary. It is important to set the record straight in respect of a fundamental misconception. The Socialist Workers' Party were not arguing for any kind of putsch against the state. There was no talk of guillotines or bombing campaigns. The aims of revolutionary socialism are to transform society from within, readdressing the balance of power away from the minority that holds it to the majority that should. That process has to be democratic by definition. They campaigned on issues such as sexual discrimination, racism, low pay, unsafe working conditions, unemployment, and poverty, all of which needed transforming. They focused on building a mass movement and broad-based campaigns with the aim of helping to create a better society. Transforming society for the benefit of the majority by the majority should not be seen as a threat to the safety of the well-being of the state. Using an open democratic organization to try to create a broad-based democratic movement should not be seen as an attempt to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy. But transforming society on the issues that the SWP were campaigning on would ultimately have a detrimental effect on the establishment. And that explains the timing of the 1972 MI5 redefinition of subversion. 1972 was the year of three major industrial disputes: Saltley Gate, the dock strike, and the builders' workers' strike. All were designed to better the living conditions of the workers. All were examples of unified people power. All were successful, and ultimately, all impacted negatively on capitalism. It also explains the obsessive focusing of the SDS on the personal details and employment of trade union affiliation of their targets and the massive data trawl of leftists rather than rightists that the operation had become. Colin Clark, HN80, and Phil Cooper, HN155. MI5 had a long-standing interest in SDS officers rising up the hierarchy to the SWP headquarters. They made it clear to the SDS management that their ideal would be a permanent, well-placed employee in headquarters, not necessarily too high up in the organization. The SDS did exactly as they were told. Colin Clark and Phil Cooper both became the national treasurers of the Right to Work campaign, and both were close to the Central Committee, in headquarters, but not too high up. the fact that they took those positions in direct succession to each other meant that for 6 years, between 1978 and 1983, MI5 had their permanent source exactly where they wanted it. This tasking was not a public order related tasking. That is why the SDS struggled in their annual reports to attribute any disorder to the campaign. In the words of the SDS themselves, the campaign was an organization to fight for the rights of trades unions, individuals and groups of workers, and against the oppression of management and government, in particular at this time of high employment and anti-union legislation. The aim, again, in the SDS's own words, was for pressure to be brought to bear against management and government when fighting short-time working, redundancies and unemployment, or demanding improved pay and or conditions. That description given by the SDS is an accurate assessment of the SWP engaging in militant trade unionism. Militant trade unionism was an area that neither MI5 nor Special Branch were permitted to investigate. However, the infiltrations into the SWP, targeted as they were designed to do exactly that. Clark and Cooper's roles were different to those who had obtained positions of responsibility in the Troops Out movement. Rick Gibson, HN 297, and Mike James, HN 96, had left that organization destabilized and ineffective after their successive leaderships. There is some evidence that Cooper was deliberately creating discord within SWP headquarters and was doing so with the connivance of MI5 and SDS senior officers. But the Security Service disclosure is silent on the detail. And of course, the police do not know where their papers are. Primarily, Clark and Cooper took their positions to harvest intelligence on the SWP's organizational structure, administration, finances, and membership. That's what they did. They used their attendance at almost every national delegate conference and annual Skegness rally from 1977 to 1983 to speak to hundreds of members and gather personal details. They used their access to the party headquarters and computer system to steal the organization's data and the data of its members, as ordered by MI5. Cooper even ended up in complete control of the Right to Work campaign bank account. The scale and scope of the reporting, the number of people with files opened on them is astonishing. Just by way of a few examples from a mass of reporting, the annual 1980 annual Easter rally at Skegness, the SDS listed over 1,000 named attendees from across the UK. Their addresses, and in the majority of cases, their Special Branch file numbers were noted alongside their names. On a list of 198 named attendees at a peaceful Blair Peach demonstration, only 7 were listed as having no trace on Special Branch files. From the SWP's National Delegate Conference in 1978, just under 300 names were listed alongside the addresses, trade union membership, and file references. The report on the National Delegate Conference on 1978 is 171 pages long. It contains detailed analysis of administration and finance, breakdowns of branch by branch membership nationwide, an extensive list of unions that had SWP members and a full breakdown of educational institutions with SWP members. The report on the 1982 Right to Work campaign march was more a detailed list of financial contributors than anything else, with pages and pages of photocopied checks. The SDS reported on people and sent their details to MI5 simply for buying copies of the Socialist Worker newspaper. On one occasion that we know of, a 15-year-old boy had his personal details recorded and sent to MI5 because he read the Socialist Worker and had been to anti-Nazi demonstrations. Clark and Cooper's reporting covers the same themes as other undercover officers. Their indexes contain more reports on personal details, such as the physical appearances and relationship statuses of female activists, than anything remotely disorder related. But the real focus is on members' employment details and trade union affiliations. And that brings us to a topic that is of particular importance to Richard Chessum, but plainly impacts on the members of every leftist organization that was infiltrated by these officers. Blacklisting, where the reports of these officers impacted on the financial well-being, security, and prospects of targets and their families, wrecking countless lives. Blacklisting and the trade unions. The evidence of the senior officers disclosed in this phase makes repeated reference to SDS reports being used for vetting, which was an activity of both MI5 and special branches. SDS officers have been answering specific MI5 requests for information on employment since at least, coincidentally, 1972. There was a real danger of blacklisting for the SWP membership, with individual members of the SWP losing their jobs for often spurious reasons. At the same time, there were reports that the Metropolitan Police often visited the office of the Economic League with files about trade unionists. Richard Chessum gave evidence as to how, despite his qualifications and decency, he was repeatedly refused employment. The inquiry disclosure in phase 3 gives a great deal of insight into the liaison between MI5 and special branch on the issue of vetting. An example is a fractious exchange of documents between the two, where MI5 set down a marker. The passing of information to employers about their employees is the role of MI5 rather than that of special branch. The document is clearly meant and taken as a rebuke. It clearly indicates that special branch had been relaying employment intelligence to employers. The special branch response is phrased extremely carefully. It emphasizes that there are rules to prevent them passing such information, and that the provision of intelligence to employers is MI5's job. However, it then goes on to state that it has its own contacts, predominantly former police officers, with the employers, and a close and mutually profitable relationship with them before telling MI5 in no uncertain terms that any measure tending to restrict or inhibit our inquiry work is not acceptable to them. Stripping away the veil of plausible deniability that is a feature of most of these official documents, special branch says that there might be rules, but they have their ways of getting around them, and they are going to continue to do so. This inquiry work between special branch and employers is also referred to on the face of the disclosed Home Office documents. In 1974, a number of MPs raised concerns in a meeting with the Home Secretary about the relationship special branch had with employers and trade union management. In particular, that special branch were passing on lists of photographs of those who attended demonstrations and meetings. Interestingly, the note of this meeting was passed on to Sir James Waddell, who was responsible for reminding the SDS of the need for security. Waddell's response in a letter directly to the Home Secretary is illuminating. Unsurprisingly, it suggests reminding special branch of the need for care and discretion. On the issue of whether or not special branch were passing intelligence to employers, he said this: "We know ourselves that some employers plead to be given warning if known agitators seek or obtain employment with them. The official response has always been refusal, sometimes with a hint that there are unofficial bodies which might help. But when a special branch officer is himself seeking help from an employer or from a trade union official, is asking a good deal to expect him to insist, invariably, that he's engaged in one-way traffic." This is the close and mutually profitable relationship between special branch and employers. The passing of intelligence gleaned from SDS operations for the purpose of blacklisting. These are the customers that so many SDS managers refer to in their statements. The employers referred to include not just government departments and the civil service, but also public corporations such as the Bank of England, the BBC, the British Council, and pertinently for Richard Chessum, the Post Office. Most importantly, also include List X firms, which are private corporations engaged in government security contracts. Of course, those firms were not only involved in government security contracts. Once they had the lists of people who were concerned enough about their society as to demonstrate in order to change it, they could ensure that those people never worked again. To give an idea of the scale, between 1970 and 1973, the top 50 firms that held government defense contracts were all household names. They covered all sectors and included, for example, British Leyland, Rolls-Royce, Laird Group, British Steel, Shell, ICI, Weir Group, and Standard Telephones. We do not know how many X firms there were in total, but once those lists were passed on, there was nothing to stop them being passed on again and again amongst federations of employers, lists that were continually updated by the SDS. We raised these issues of blacklisting in our first opening statements. We are grateful to the inquiry for sourcing and disclosing this material that puts SDS and special branch involvement in blacklisting beyond doubt. These lists of demonstrators and meeting attendees were also passed to trade unions. It's important at this stage to put right another misconception. Trade unions were not founded by people who routinely liaise with police officers to assist them in blacklisting their memberships. Trade unions were founded by people like Eleanor Marx and Tom Mann, both Marxists. The narrative that organizations like the SWP infiltrated trade unions as if they were a separate species is false. It is terminology used by the SDS and the Home Office via Sir James Waddell, as part of their attempt to justify SDS infiltrations. This is the same Home Office that, when faced with MPs concerned about special branch infiltrations of unions, told them there were none, directly or indirectly. That was an outright lie. We ask that the inquiry be very careful about adopting that narrative. If anything, the infiltrators were those that betrayed their rank and file by passing their names to employers. The police say there was no direct reporting on trade unions. Any reporting was indirect, just a byproduct. That is a bending of the truth. Many trade unions supported the SWP campaigns, and when they did, they were reported on. 500 trade union branches sponsored the 1980 Right to Work March, and the detail of that support was sent to Box 500 by the SDS. The same process was adopted on every part of the Right to Work campaign. Many trade unionists joined the SWP, and when they did, they were reported on. Indeed, if a trade union subscribed to the Socialist Worker newspaper, it was reported on. These reports are littered with the trade union-related intelligence that MI5 and the Home Office have been seeking since 1972. The bulk of reporting on the SWP membership is related to employment and industrial issues, but this was not to be used for national security vetting, as the senior officers would try to have us believe. These reports were on probation officers and social workers, hospital workers, teachers, firemen, DHSS staff, workers at Ford and General Motors, bank staff, caterers, ambulance staff, British Rail staff, post office staff, trades people. More often than not, these reports detailed nothing other than their name, employment, employer details, and trade union membership. Special branches were involved in blacklisting nationally. The True Spies documentary deals with one example of special branch collusion with industry. The Ford Motor Company made investment decisions on the basis of a secret assurance involving MI5 and special branch. That deal meant that Ford would send lists of job applicants to special branch who would strike a line through names and return them. The deal was designed to prevent strikes. That is economic policing. Clark and Cooper's 1,000-strong lists of SWP members across the United Kingdom must have been incredibly useful. It is no surprise that Clark was officially commended for his work. It is also no surprise that SDS Chief Inspector Trevor Butler considered the True Spies documentary to be an earth-shattering breach of the need-to-know principle. In their Phase 1 opening statement, the designated lawyers assured the inquiry that SDS personnel were not involved in trade union blacklisting. The evidence from Phase 3 demonstrates the SDS did not ask and did not care what use their reports were put to. It is clear that the SWP members were right to be afraid of being blacklisted. The answer to the problem that government faced after the successful industrial action of 1972 was to find the workers who were prepared to stand up and take them out of the workforce. Conclusion. The Home Office knew that the intentional vagueness of their terms and definitions had left officers uncertain about the proper extent of their role. But they were not in any hurry to do anything about it. Equally, MI5, bound as they were by their own public terms of reference, were doubtless happy to continue using the SDS to gather information. Barry Moss, who was both chief inspector and superintendent of the SDS during the deployments of Clark and Cooper, was certainly one of the officers who was uncertain about his role. His definition of subversion was so loose that it is no wonder MI5 looked forward to mutually useful cooperation with him. Nothing was ever done to dispel the uncertainty. As a result, the SDS continued to just hoover up everything, irrespective of the consequences for their targets. Their senior officers encouraged them to do so. Ironically, it was Colin Clark himself who came closest to an accurate assessment of the SWP. He spent 5 years deployed at the heart of the organization, with access to every detail of its aims and activities, and was fully debriefed by MI5 at the end of his deployment. He was not operating among subversives. He said the SWP was strongly opposed to government policy, but were not seeking to subvert the institutions of the state. None of these people posed any threat to the security of the nation. Roy Creamer had it right all the way back at the beginning. He said, whilst we were looking for information, there was simply nothing to tell of. There were no hidden conspiracies anywhere, and there was nothing hidden going on.
Thank you, Mr. Scobie. For reasons that are not wholly your responsibility, you've overrun a little on the time we estimated for you. That will involve some reorganization of the programme after you, but thank you for your statement. We will now adjourn for 15 minutes, which means that we will restart sometime between 11:45 and 10:50. Ms Murphy.
Thank you, sir. So this opening statement to Tranche 1, Phase 3 of the inquiry is made on behalf of families who became aware that the identities of their dead children were appropriated for the purposes of constructing the cover identities of the undercover officers. The focus of this statement will be upon the families and the significance of the evidence that you will likely hear in this phase. So in the interest of brevity, we have abridged our written statement for the purposes of this oral statement, and it will therefore follow a somewhat different structure to the document that you have in front of you. We will also address the submissions of Mr. Skelton and Mr. Saunders and the exchanges yesterday as they relate to Category F issues. First, sir, the families on behalf of whom we make this statement. Lisa Crosland and Mark Crosland, the stepmother and brother of Kevin John Crosland, who died on the 1st of September 1966 at 5 years of age. Frank Bennett and Honor Robson, the bereaved brother and sister of Michael Hartley, who died on the 4th of August 1968 at 18 years. The father, mother, and sister of Anthony Lewis, who died on the 31st of July 1968 at 7 years. Faith Mason, the bereaved mother of Neil Robin Martin, who died on the 15th of October 1969 at 6 years. Emma Richardson, the daughter of Barbara Shaw, whose brother Rod Richardson died on the 7th of January 1973 when he was just 2 days old. Emma and Rod's mother, Barbara Shaw, who was a core participant to this inquiry, sadly passed away on the 12th of May 2021. And finally, sir, a family who have been required to participate anonymously by reason of an order restricting the relevant cover name and therefore the family name. In their opening statements to earlier phases of this inquiry, the bereaved families told you about the devastating loss of their children and the horror they suffered when they learned that the children's identities had been appropriated by the undercover officers. Those statements also addressed the moral abhorrence of the practice and the gross, repeated, and long-standing unlawful interferences with their rights at common law and those protected by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The evidence that you heard, sir, in April and May last year has further crystallised for the families the absence of any necessity for adopting or maintaining this practice, and indeed for the very existence of the SDS. The current stage of the inquiry is a particularly important one for the families, as it is in this phase that you will hear the best available evidence as to the origins of the practice, its adoption, and how it came to be normalised within the practices of the SDS, leading to its adoption by the MPOIU. So you heard last year, and the families have taken note, that some junior officers did appreciate the moral implications of what they were being required to do. That they were both mindful of the possibility that families would come to learn of what was being done in their loved ones' names, that their grief would be compounded. That evidence provides an important context for the evidence that you will hear from the early managers over the coming days. The evidence of the most senior of them, retired Chief Superintendent Geoffrey Kraft, retired Commander Barry Moss, retired Chief Inspector Angus McIntosh, and retired Chief Inspector Trevor Butler, is to similar effect. The SDS was a secret operation, operating in isolation from and outside both moral and legal norms. They had every confidence that its secrets would remain secret. The practice there was antithetical to the policing by consent model, the model by which the Metropolitan Police have asserted legitimacy for 2 centuries. It is a recurrent feature of the evidence you will hear that these senior officers saw no difficulty in pursuing practices that the families and the public at large would obviously condemn. They were at all times confident that they would not be found out. We invite you, sir, to conclude that this confidence, derived as it was from the exceptional secrecy that was gifted to the SDS, was the cause of the illegality that became the hallmark of the SDS. So confidence in not getting found out is an extraordinary foundation for the decision-making of senior police officers, judged by the standards of any decade. The references we have heard to mercenaries, to fictional assassins, to the KGB, tell you, sir, that public approval for the existence, actions, and behaviour of the SDS could not have been further from the minds of these senior officers. So you will recall that Barbara Shaw was a central figure in the bereaved family's pursuit of information and accountability. It was she who recorded a formal complaint to the Metropolitan Police in 2013 concerning the use of her son's identity. And it was she who challenged the Metropolitan Police's reliance upon the policy of neither confirming nor denying the practice. Shortly after her death, her family learned that the CPS had found sufficient evidence to justify a criminal prosecution of EN32, the officer who had appropriated Rod's identity. The identified charge was of making an untrue statement for the purposes of procuring a passport contrary to Section 36 of the Criminal Justice Act 1925. However, it was assessed that such a prosecution would not be in the public interest because EN32's actions were in accordance with his training and the working practices of the MPOIU at the time. Those working practices were, as you will recall, inherited from the SDS. We will return to the topic of criminal offences when we address you concerning the prosecution and conviction of Mr. Mulvena. It is, of course, desperately sad that Mrs. Shaw has not lived to hear the evidence from the managers, nor to hear your conclusions. Many of the other family members are also of advanced years. They have clung to the hope of answers, only to have those answers elude them by the pace of the inquiry's work. They seek answers within their lifetimes about why their loved ones' identities were taken and the extent to which their personal lives were violated. We turn to the circumstances of the family who may only currently participate in this inquiry anonymously. So we know that you are acutely aware of the circumstances of this family. The restriction order was imposed after they were notified that their loved one's identity had been used. And as the order inevitably relates to their loved one's identity, it also relates to their identity. The consequence is that the family may only participate in this inquiry anonymously. In common with other restriction orders, breach would place the family and those from whom they have sought support in jeopardy of imprisonment, fines, and asset seizures. The family have been informed that no reasons for the imposition of the order can be extended to them. As you, sir, are fully aware, this family suffered the traumatic early death of a much-loved child. Related family traumas of the most extreme character and re-traumatization when they learn that their loved one's identity had been appropriated. Your team met with the family members in April of this year, and no one in attendance at that meeting can have been left in any doubt as to the impact of this inquiry, charged as it is with investigating the misuse of their loved one's identity, its self-imposing restrictions upon the family's use of their identity. Against a backdrop of unspeakable trauma, the family feel degraded, humiliated, debased, and silenced, both in the public domain and in their personal relations. The family have been shut out from the opportunity to scrutinise whether even the process that resulted in the imposition of the restriction took proper account of the ongoing gross interference with their rights. The full circumstances of this family's experience cannot currently be addressed in this opening statement, nor currently form any part of the inquiry's considerations in open session. The inquiry's consideration of Category F issues is inevitably impoverished in consequence. Nevertheless, the bare facts that it is possible to set out in open session exemplify the legal and moral repugnance of the SDS operational practice. So we hope that progress can be made in alleviating this family's distress at the closed hearing that you have requested your team to convene in the coming weeks. I turn to the transition to a practice of relying upon the identities of dead children and the lack of operational justification for that change. So you expressed confidence yesterday that the evidence will allow you to identify the point in time to within a month or two when the transition from reliance upon fictitious to real identities occurred. The families look forward to understanding the evidential basis for that confidence. From the disclosure shared with the families to date, we can only say this. First, that officers deployed prior to 1974 relied upon fictitious identities. And secondly, that many officers deployed from 1974, between 1974 and 1982, relied upon real identities, but others did not. We note in the designated lawyer group original opening statement, they assert that reliance upon fictitious cover identities was, quote, reviewed and abandoned after a number of undercover officers were compromised or outed, and that the practice of relying upon the identities of dead children was formalized in about 1973. The evidential basis for those assertions is entirely unclear on the basis of the open material. Among those relying upon fictitious identities who have given evidence in Tranche 1, there is not a single instance of their deployment being compromised in consequence, so far as we are aware. The absence of operational justification for the practice is, though, clear on the open material. First, the regional and national crime squads policing operations who were deploying undercover officers in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s did so without reliance upon the identities of dead children. There were alternatives. Secondly, undercover officers who relied upon fictitious identities were, we know, able to find, to secure official documents, documents which they considered sufficient. Conrad Dixon referred to the UCOs obtaining necessary papers long before the practice became to exploit the identities of the dead. The need to obtain identity documents cannot reasonably be advanced by way of justification. Thirdly, compromise of UCO's cover in these early years was entirely independent of identity choice. Significantly, Rick Clark, one of the first UCOs to deploy using a dead child's identity, was confronted by activists with the birth and death certificate of that child in 1976. This event was well known among senior SDS officers at the time, and no doubt beyond. It is even referenced in the Tradecraft manual prepared many years later. The reality acknowledged by HN 126 was that Rick Clark alone bore the responsibility for the compromise of his cover. He was not assisted by having relied upon the identity of a dead child. The existence of a death certificate made his cover less secure. Angus McIntosh should be able to offer particular assistance to you in your scrutiny of the SDS response to the compromise of Rick Clark and its aftermath. Notably, his statement is silent on the topic, although he admits to an advisory role in the process of officers acquiring cover identities. The manager's statements do not reveal why there was a change in practice, nor who took responsibility for the change. It is their evidence that it was the preferred method or the norm, although Mr. Bryce would have it that he had no awareness of the practice. Certainly none accept responsibility other than tacit endorsement. In seeking to unravel all of this, we invite you, sir, to consider the transferring governance of the SDS from C to S squad in July 1974. We note the stated intention of increasing oversight. Significantly, recruitment of UCOs occurred alongside those governance changes, significant recruitment in numbers. The change in the SDS practice in the creation of cover identities on the open documents appears to have been contemporaneous and potentially related to those events. But we also invite you to scrutinise with care the discrepancies between the evidence of the UCOs, the managers, and the contemporaneous records as to how identity creation was managed and how the processes were reported up the chain of command. Our analysis of that material is set out in our written statement, and it's not repeated this afternoon. But we invite careful scrutiny because it will, in the family's view, assist you in establishing where the truth lies and whether the managers are presenting to you a full, accurate, and complete picture. And of course, the families invite scrutiny of why the obvious and inherent risks of relying upon a real identity do not appear to have come into focus. They invite consideration of the role that the UCOs played in their own compromise and ask who, if anyone, was taking responsibility for managing all of this. We turn next to the potential inspirations for the practice. Operation Hearn and the families in their statements to this inquiry have considered the potential cultural and media origins of the practice. In Tranche 1, Phase 2, you heard from HN 126, who explained that they had, quote, all watched The Day of the Jackal a couple of years earlier. And it was his understanding that the idea of using the identity of someone dead had sprung from that film. Similar evidence is offered by Mr. Kraft and Mr. Moss in their statements to this phase, although it may be that Mr. Kraft's evidence in this regard has now developed. So in his statement of the 23rd of February 2022, Mr. Kraft has provided an additional perspective. He explained that he had, quote, prosecuted someone who had used this method to create passports for members of the KGB. So we knew, in Mr. Kraft's words, that it was a pretty secure method. So Mr. Kraft's statement, made with the benefit of hindsight, referencing the workings of a security agency of the Soviet military as a basis for operational confidence in the practice of relying upon the identities of dead children, is highly significant from the perspective of the families. The designated lawyers have now helpfully provided a substantial bundle of press clippings concerning that prosecution. A prosecution that led to Mr. Mulvena pleading guilty in respect of offences associated with his having obtained a passport in the name of a dying and then dead man, and his being sentenced to the maximum term of imprisonment available. The press reporting referred to the dead man's unsuspecting family and a loophole, as you referred to yesterday, sir, in the British passport system, and indeed Somerset House being quoted as stating that a system of automatically stamping birth certificates deceased would obviously involve tremendous additional cost to the overheads at Somerset House. So we learn from those press reports that DCI Matt Roger, as he was at that time, was the special branch officer responsible for that prosecution. And you will recall, sir, he went on to become the special branch commander with responsibility for the SDS between 72 and 75. He was a visitor to the SDS safe house, and he socialized with the UCOs. Whether it was he, Commander Cunningham, or another who introduced the practice to the SDS, if that is the route by which it was introduced, the Mulvena case can hardly be a basis for confidence in the operational effectiveness of the tactic. The exposure of Mr. Mulvena's tactics in securing a British passport for the KGB was front page news. It was little wonder that activists were able to confirm their suspicions in relation to Rick Clark by confronting him with a death certificate. What is really more surprising is that the SDS did not immediately abandon the technique at that point. So it strains credulity that no living witness can assist you as to why and when there was a significant departure from the historical reliance upon fictitious cover identities. That was a tactic which had proven both effective and secure, which had not resulted, to our knowledge, in compromise, and which did not in itself offend societal norms or the fundamental principles of policing. Were the drivers the publication of the novel The Day of the Jackal in 1971? Or perhaps more significantly, the release in cinemas of the movie in May 1973. There is certainly a temporal relationship. Or were the SDS relying upon KGB tactics and ones that had not even proven successful? Were they introduced by Mr. Roger or Mr. Cunningham? What scrutiny was brought to bear on the whole endeavour, if any? We invite you, sir, to pay particularly close scrutiny to the evidence of Mr. Kraft and Mr. Bryce on this topic. We invite you not to assume that the evidence being presented to you is fully frank and complete. We turn then to a central issue: the moral perspectives on the practice. In the previous phase, HN 200 told you that he had challenged the instruction to rely upon the identity of a dead child. He said, "I can't remember at all who told me because I was a bit upset." And I actually said, "Why is that necessary?" Because it wasn't something that sat comfortably with me. It was his evidence that he assumed he had no alternative. HN 80, who deployed between March 77 and March 82, was managed by Mr. Kraft and Mr. Ferguson. He told you that while some UCOs use the identity of a deceased child, he refused to do so. He said that it distressed him to consider using the details from a dead child's birth certificate, and he knew that it would necessarily cause distress to that child's family if it was discovered. No manager admits to similar reflection contemporaneously. David Bicknell states that the use of deceased children's identities chimed with his experience of World War II, and said that, quote, "we had an unsentimental attitude of getting on with the job no matter what." It is telling that his perspective was upon police officers overcoming their discomfort, not the family's perspectives. Geoffrey Craft observes, quote, "the only potential harm of using the deceased child's identity was to renew the grief of bereaved parents that had suffered the worst loss anyone could suffer. Looking back on it, that is the way I see it. I am not aware of what thought was given to the issue by more senior individuals. He considered it inconceivable that the bereaved families would become aware. Reflection had revealed the obvious moral implications of the practice, but there had been no reflection at the time, only confidence that no one would ever know." Mr. Moss states, "with hindsight, reliance on this practice was regrettable. As he saw it, there was no other option. I think the SDS believed the operation would remain secret and that families would not be caused distress by learning about this practice." Again, hindsight revealed to him the moral implications, but at the time, confidence in secrecy overwhelmed the thinking. Similarly, Mr. Butler, "once I was aware of the practice, I tacitly approved it. I do not believe the potential impact on the families of the deceased children was ever discussed. The SDS was a top secret unit carrying out highly sensitive work, and the assumption was that relatives would never become aware of the practice." Mr. McIntosh, "I made no attempt to stop the practice as I did not think it was wrong. It was not against the law." Mr. Bryce does not even address the harm that has been caused to the bereaved families, nor does he provide any evidence by way of purported justification. There is an obvious tension between the evidence of Mr. Craft, who derived reassurance as to the operational effectiveness of the tactic from the experience of the successful prosecution of someone who had assisted the KGB, and Mr. McIntosh's assertion that the practice was not against the law. The category F CPs invite you to conclude that the practice was in fact clearly unlawful, both at common law, by reference to international human rights standards, and as the decision of the CPS in relation to EN 32 may explain, and the experience of Mr. Craft confirms, there was every prospect of criminal law infringements also. There is no significant evidence available to the inquiry that senior officers either appreciated the very real harm to bereaved families and chose nevertheless to run that risk, or that they were callously oblivious. Wherever the truth lies, those managers were in dereliction of their duties when they authorized and/or condoned the practice without any critical reflection upon the risk of real harm and the lack of any reasonable justification for the change in practice. The belief that they would not get caught out is no justification at all. We move on to address the calls for additional evidence from the Temporary Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and the Designated Lawyers Group. We address only their suggestion that you might find answers in relation to the practice of relying upon the identities of dead children by delving into the practices of the Security Service MI5 or the Secret Intelligence Service MI6, or even, to the extent there is this suggestion, by delving into the practices of the KGB. We make a few brief points. As you, sir, have identified, your responsibility is to examine the practices of the SDS, a policing body. The practices of MI5 or MI6 in identity creation are irrelevant. They offer neither explanation nor mitigation. There is evidence before the inquiry from the UCOs and the managers that the inspiration came from the actions of a fictional assassin in the day of the Jackal. And we are now invited by the designated lawyers group, and it would appear Geoffrey Craft, to consider whether, as an alternative, it was the involvement of those with close connections with the CDS in the Mulvena prosecution that led the CDS to adopt a practice learned from the KGB. That evidence, of course, merits investigation because it assists you as to who within the SDS initiated the practice, why and when. It also assists you on the issue of the purported justification for the practice and the failures of managers to provide legal and moral leadership within the SDS. But what practices those other agencies in fact adopted does not. We invite you to reject that invitation as a distraction from your central task of scrutinising the actions of the Metropolitan Police. So by way of conclusion, we say this. It was the manager's responsibility to ensure that the workings of the SDS were ethical and within the law. A responsibility that was all the more acute given the extraordinary levels of secrecy that surrounded the unit. The very nature of the operation of the SDS carried obvious risks to the public perception of the Metropolitan Police, and those risks are repeatedly acknowledged within the contemporaneous records. The unique features of the unit increase the need for probity. They do not provide a justification for its absence. The manager's reliance upon secrecy was in any event ill thought out. There were, of course, multiple ways in which the bereaved families could find out: through the compromise of a UCO's cover, through publicity, by accident, and in the manner in which the families did ultimately come to find out, as a byproduct of the exposure of the broader unlawful and reprehensible actions of the UCOs. So the SDS was an entirely misguided enterprise, targeted as it was at civil society without any reasonable justification. It operated in secrecy and in isolation. It developed practices that were the stuff of spy movies and novels. And we now learn the KGB. In the post-1974 period, the UCOs were compelled by their superiors in their very first steps towards deployment to place policing ethics and legalities to one side. In the words of Mr. Craft, cover identity creation was the key issue and first matter to be done. Illegality was compelled by the very individuals whose duty it was to ensure that the UCOs operated within a legal and ethical framework. Those managers must bear the responsibility for the development of a toxic culture that pervaded the unit and became its internal fabric. The temporary commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has recently acknowledged that failures of leadership within the Metropolitan Police have permitted toxic cultures to fester within certain units, with the result that extreme misconduct has permeated them, and which he has acknowledged is not a matter of a few bad apples. Thus, sir, the inquiry's work remains of critical relevance to modern policing. The families encouraged the inquiry to identify the malpractice that permeated every layer of the SDS operation and where the responsibility lay. In their view, the inquiry will be compelled to conclude that the SDS managers, officers who went on to hold the most senior positions within the Metropolitan Police over a further 2 decades, not only failed to challenge and expose the heinous goings on within the SDS, but actively encouraged them and indeed compelled the UCOs to commit criminal acts and civil wrongs, and to base their entire deployment upon the morally repugnant practice of assuming the identity of a dead child. Their directions, sir, set the tone for everything that followed. Thank you, sir. That is the opening statement for this phase on behalf of the Category F core participants.
Thank you very much. Something that you said led me to believe I may not have expressed myself yesterday with sufficient clarity. May I do so again to avoid future misunderstanding? I said I have no expectation that I will be able to identify the date when the use of deceased children's identities started within a month or two, but I had every hope and every reason to believe that I would be able to identify the approximate time. I think you slightly misunderstood my words.
You're quite right, I did, sir, and thank you for that clarification.
Thank you very much indeed. We will now adjourn for 15 minutes, and we will start with Miss Kilroy. She knows and has kindly agreed to vary her timetable so that we will have a break in the middle for lunch rather than carrying on until well into the afternoon before she stops. Thank you very much. Ms. Kilroy,
Ah,
we all know the start of your submissions has been delayed for reasons that are outside your control and mine, and it means inevitably that they're going to be interrupted by the lunch break. Please take your time and whatever moment is convenient to you to break.
I'm very grateful for that, sir. So, 260 years ago, on the 11th of November, 1762, the then Secretary of State, the Earl of Halifax, sent Nathan Carrington and 3 other of the King's messengers to the home of John Entick, with a warrant to seize and apprehend him, together with his books and papers, and bring them all to the Secretary of State for examination. It was a time of high political ferment, stirred by multiple issues, including war with France concerning overseas colonies. Entick was one of the contributors to a political journal, The Monitor, which regularly criticised the government. He was said in the warrant to be the author of several weekly, very seditious papers, which contain gross and scandalous reflections and invectives upon His Majesty's government and upon both Houses of Parliament. The 4 messengers duly ransacked John Entick's house. They were there for 4 hours, searching for and reading books and private papers in several rooms. In fact, they found nothing seditious, but nonetheless seized papers and took them and Entick away. In due course, he sued for trespass. The resulting judgment of Lord Camden, Chief Justice, Entick and Carrington, is widely acknowledged as one of the most important constitutional judgments in the common law, a judgment which reinforces this jurisdiction's commitment to the rule of law. In short, it established that the government must have legal authority in statute or common law before it can interfere with individual rights, including by trespassing on private property, and the state cannot simply assert, by warrant or otherwise, state necessity as a justification. That case also confirmed the common law's aversion to general warrants, warrants which authorize state officers to search private persons or property for evidence of alleged crimes on a non-specific or speculative basis. The Earl of Halifax's warrant fell foul of both these principles, and Carrington had therefore committed trespass. As Lord Camden explained, had the point been determined in favour of Carrington, the secret cabinets and bureaus of every subject in the kingdom will be thrown open to the search and inspection of the messenger, whenever the Secretary of State shall think fit to charge or even to suspect a person to be the author, printer, or publisher of a seditious libel, his house rifled, and his most valuable secrets taken out of his possession. Sir, the principle in Entick and Carrington, together with the common law fundamental rights of personal security, liberty, and property, underpin much of modern policing and state security law. It is, of course, the police who are most frequently called upon to interfere with fundamental rights of person and property, using arrests, searches, and seizures in order to prevent and investigate crime and maintain the peace. Their ability to do so is, in British law, heavily circumscribed. They must be able to point to statutory powers or common law permissions, which usually require the existence of imminent risks or evidence of serious crimes. Fast forward 200 years to another politically febrile era. In 1968, in the midst of the Cold War, a large protest against the Vietnam War turned violent and shook the political establishment. The Secretary of State appears to have considered that Special Branch, the division of the police which monitored protests and political groups, had been caught short. Another large march was expected on the same issue later that year. Consequently, a decision was taken to establish a secret policing unit whose undercover officers would infiltrate various groups thought likely to join the demonstration and gather intelligence aimed at preventing a repeat of the same violence and disorder. Unfortunately, the unit appears to have been created without any regard being paid to the legality of the police's conduct. No statute was passed to give them special powers. Instead, extraordinary lengths were taken to keep the unit's existence secret, including from Parliament. Before very long, undercover officers were being deployed for years at a time, given cover names, accommodation, and cover employment, and instructed to infiltrate left-wing political or protest groups. Posing as trusted fellow members, they would be invited to and did attend private meetings, including in private homes and properties, where they spied on people. They were given very little direction as to who to target and what to report, and in practice reported almost everything. They gathered huge volumes of private and sometimes clearly confidential information about members of the groups, their political views, and any impending plans for protests. And then they shared that information with other agencies. Sir, these activities plainly conflicted with the law, and not just any law, the law set out in Entic and Carrington, one of the bedrocks of the rule of law and policing. Undercover officers trespassed in private property. They operated without any warrant at all, on instructions so wide they could select for themselves who to target and what to collect. And they recorded and shared with other agencies private information about people's thoughts, political opinions, and lives. But those in charge of that unit, the special, I'm going to call the SDS, the Special Demonstration Squad, had a weapon the Earl of Halifax did not have: secrecy. Neither the courts nor the public knew what they were doing, and so they carried on doing it for decades, with successive secretaries of state authorizing the continuation of the unit. I need to take another leap forward in time. In July 2010, alone in her car, a woman the inquiry knows as Lisa opened the glove box. She was on holiday in Italy with her partner of 6 years, Mark Stone. His passport was there. She opened it. The photograph was him, but the name was Mark Kennedy. He made excuses, but before long, by October 2010, his story has unraveled. What happened is now well known. It turned out that for 7 years, he had been an undercover police officer in the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, NPOIU, posing as environmental activist Mark Stone. It's now apparent he had other sexual relationships with between 6 to 11 women. Mark's story was not the only thing that unraveled. After it appeared in the press, it eventually emerged that for at least 3 decades, scores of other officers from the SDS and NPOIU had infiltrated social, political, and justice movements, posing as members. They had invaded the private lives and homes of thousands of law-abiding citizens, the vast majority of whom neither had nor ever would commit any criminal offence, still less a serious one. Incredibly, Mark was just one of many officers who had engaged in sexual relationships. Some had had children. The secrecy shrouding the acts of the SDS since 1968 had finally lifted. Sir, it is as a result of this accidental discovery that this inquiry has been established. And before I come on to the core of my statement, I want to reflect on that. In Class and Germany in the 1970s, the very era we are examining, the European Court of Human Rights said this about secret surveillance powers: they are a menace to all citizens. They characterize the police state. This is the court's words. They pose a danger of undermining or even destroying democracy on the ground of defending it. Why did the court say that? So in my submission, in secrecy, abuse of power thrives. And so while increasing the risk of abuse, secrecy also interferes with people's ability to detect and correct it. That is so even when there are safeguards and a fortiori when there are none. That is why in all democracies governed by the rule of law, covert powers are reserved for the most serious crimes and threats. In those cases, the risk to democracy from the use of covert powers can reasonably be said to be outweighed by the risk they seek to curtail. But no one should ever be under any illusions. Covert powers are always dangerous to democracy and must always be sparingly used and only where absolutely necessary. So I'm here today on behalf of the CAT-H core participants, or CPs, who are women who were deceived by NPOIU and SDS undercover officers into intimate sexual relationships, together with the child of one of those relationships and one man who was deceived into a close long-term friendship. The inquiry has already heard evidence from undercover officers active in the Tranche 1 period, that's 1968 to 1982. That evidence has shown that at least 6 officers had sexual relationships with with many women. In the next week, the inquiry will hear evidence from some of their managers. The CAT-H CPs wish to make clear that while they abhor and condemn the acts of the UCOs, the undercover officers who so grossly debased and deceived them, they do not accept that the responsibility stops there. After all, young policemen were sent into people's homes and private lives to pose as activists for years. That created the obvious risk that relationships would occur. And yet, no steps at all were taken to meet that risk. And that is even as managers permitted the theft of the identities of deceased children, which we've just been hearing about, spent public money on cover accommodation and vehicles, and created cover employment to avoid the risk of undercover officers being detected. And of course, decisions were also taken to abandon all the central principles of English common law and core tenets of policing, as I've explained, when the invasion of homes was authorised, simply to find out how many officers to send to police demonstrations, and we'll come on to some of the evidence about that, and whether people's views were subversive or not. It wasn't these undercover officers who kept the true extent of the activities of the SDS and NPOIU shrouded in secrecy for decades, so that cessation of all of this scrutiny and accountability, when it finally came only by accident. The responsibility for all of this lies with inspectors, chief inspectors, superintendents, commissioners, MI5 officials, and politicians in the Home Office. So you will be exploring with those managers who are giving oral evidence their responsibility for and/or complicity with what went wrong. The conclusions to be drawn from that evidence will be the subject of submissions in due course. In this oral opening, I will address the legal issues raised by the SDS's operations and the legal framework against which we say the issues raised by the terms of reference must be assessed. And I will also set out CAT-H's position on that law. So the primary focus of this statement and of the written statement, which is in much more detail, is the common law. But I do say, in response to observations that you made yesterday, sir, that the UK's international obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights are also relevant to this inquiry's terms of reference. And that is for 3 reasons. First, and most straightforwardly, this was applicable and relevant law, even though international. The UK had, at international law, an obligation to comply with those laws, had made a commitment to do so, and clearly intended to do so. Any failure to so comply is relevant to this inquiry's assessment of the adequacy of the statutory, policy, and judicial regulation of undercover policing. And that is one of the questions that this inquiry has been asked. Indeed, in my respectful submission, it is difficult to see how the inquiry could conclude that regulation, governance, and oversight was adequate if it had failed to ensure compliance with the UK's international obligations. The second reason, sir, is, as already explained, one of the great iniquities of secrecy is that it obstructs accountability. So following one case in the European Court concerning secret powers in 1985, the UK changed the domestic law. Again, after another case, Khan, at the end of the 1990s, the UK changed domestic law. In relation to the SDS's operations, it is reasonable to assume that in the absence of secrecy, a successful claim to the Court of Human Rights would have led to a change in law and practice earlier than the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, and furthermore would have likely have been more effective than that act in eliminating some of these practices. That has got to be, in my submission, relevant to this inquiry's recommendations as to how to ensure greater accountability for secret practices in future. Thirdly, and relatedly, the inquiry is asked to examine the effect on individuals in particular and the public in general. The breach of their fundamental rights at international law, in relation to which, but for secrecy, they could have achieved redress in Strasbourg, is plainly a serious effect in a number of different ways. So I should also address Section 2 of the Inquiries Act, which was raised by both the Metropolitan Police Service and the designated lawyers representative. For the MPS, Mr. Skelton accepted that notwithstanding that provision, the legal framework was relevant to this inquiry's task. Mr. Sanders, on the other hand, tried to suggest otherwise. He was wrong. Section 2 does not prevent an inquiry from examining lawfulness when it is relevant to the issue which must be addressed. What it says is that no individual's civil or criminal liability may be determined. That is a quite different prohibition aimed at leaving determinations of liability and, of course, the redress or remedies which flow from them to ordinary courts. As far as this inquiry's function is concerned, as you said yesterday, how can an act be considered justified when it was unlawful? And that must be a fortiori, or even more so, when that act is of the police sworn to uphold law and order. If there were any doubt about this, it has been resolved in the course of inquests and inquiries. And just one case I mention here today is Pounder from 2009, where the High Court quashed an inquest which had failed to address lawfulness, where Rule 42 of the coroner's rules provided an almost identical prohibition to Section 2. If it comes to it, I can provide the inquiry with these examples, although Mr. Sanders may retreat from his provisional submissions. So turning to the law, what is the law? Sir, more detailed submissions are in our written opening, and this is going to be a short summary. I want to start with freedom of expression, because that is the right that those spied on by the SDS were exercising. It is a right integral to democracy, and it is protected both by common law and the Convention. Lord Steyn in Ex Parte Sims said, "In a democracy, it is the primary right. Without it, an effective rule of law is not possible." Article 10 of the Convention consequently expressly protects the freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to share them without interference. And that includes being able to do so without attracting the attention of the police and without being monitored and placed under surveillance. And confirmation for that comes from the recent case of the IPT in Wilson. To be lawful, any interference with the right of freedom of expression by the state must meet a pressing social need, and this is all familiar territory to you, sir, and be no more restrictive or intrusive than required. Our courts have said in this regard that there is no difference in principle between English law and Article 10. And the references are in our written statement to Attorney General and Guardian newspapers and Derbyshire County Council and Times newspapers. Equally, as we've already heard, as I've already touched on, the subject of muscular protection at common law and under the Convention is the home and the family. The common law has for centuries zealously protected the sanctity of people's homes and the freedom and security of their persons and possessions. It has consequently imposed limits on police interference with those fundamental rights through the law of trespass. As the courts have stated, our law holds the property of every man so sacred that no man can set his foot upon his neighbour's close without his leave. If he does, he is a trespasser, though he does no damage at all. If he will tread upon his neighbour's ground, he must justify it by law. And that is Entign Carrington. The courts have also said the fundamental principle, plain and incontestable, is that every person's body is inviolate. Any interference with it, however slight, constitutes a trespass in the absence of lawful excuse. The private citizen is thus entitled to assert the inviolability of her home, her person, her goods, and her private information against trespass and breach of confidence. Article 8 of the Convention, too, protects home, family, private life, and correspondence. Now, importantly, sir, as already touched on, the police, like any other citizen, must strictly justify their trespasses or other torts. The burden lies on them to do so, and there are countless references in our written statement and elsewhere to that effect. That burden lies on them under common law and under the European Convention, which is closely modelled in my submission on the law of trespass. I pause here to respond to something Mr. Sanders said yesterday. He suggested anything a public authority does is lawful until set aside in a public law court. I'm afraid that submission is wrong. It's correct that a statutory instrument is presumed lawful until set aside. It's not correct that a trespass to land or person is presumed lawful until shown otherwise. At common law, prior to the passage of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, police could enter property and execute searches when arresting offenders and preventing imminent crime, injury, or breach of the peace. Importantly, however, as Lord Denning confirmed in Garney and Jones, and I quote, "The common law does not permit police officers or anyone else to ransack anyone's house or search for papers or articles therein, or to search his person simply to see if he may have committed some crime or other. If police officers should do so, they would be guilty of a trespass." And that 1970 statement is, of course, echoing ENTIC, which I opened with earlier on. Even when a power is vested in a person to issue search warrants, no warrant can be lawful, which requires the exercise of judgment or discretion by the official executing the warrant as to which individuals or which property should be targeted. That was the position explained recently in Privacy International by the Divisional Court. Were such a power to exist, it would be, quote, "totally subversive of the liberty of the subject." That is Wilkes and Wood, and that is 1763 Lord Camden. So we've set out in the written legal framework some of the other ways in which a police officer, like a private person, might justify a trespass. But using deception or tricks to gain an invite is not one of them. And that is a point that you put to the police representatives, call participants yesterday. Similarly, Article 8 of the Convention protects people's homes, families, and private lives from interference by the state. And as I've said, the rigorous standards set in relation to ordinary state interference are enhanced where the powers exercised are covert. So there are other rights in play also. Article 3, which prohibits inhuman and degrading treatment. Article 14, which prohibits discrimination on the grounds of gender or political beliefs. All these rights were addressed in the context of undercover policing in the case of Wilson. So both Mr. Skelton and Mr. Sanders have attempted to diminish the importance of the judgment in Wilson. In that case, the IPT, or Investigatory Powers Tribunal, concluded that the MPS and the National Police Chiefs Council had violated Kate Wilson's Article 3, 8, 10, and 11 and 14 rights over several years of infiltration and surveillance of the social and environmental groups of which she was a member. 6 undercover officers from the NPOIU were involved, and one of the undercover officers, Mark Kennedy, had entered into a sexual relationship with Kate Wilson. Now, we have addressed that judgment in detail in the final section of our legal framework, and I won't repeat that summary, but I do want to highlight a few points concerning its relevance to this inquiry, at this stage of the inquiry. The judgment is obviously highly relevant to the question of whether the rights of those spied on by the SDS were violated. Mr. Skelton says it's a judgment on its facts. That is, of course, correct, but the parity between the acts and the facts concerning the SDS and those of the NPOIU in the Wilson period, and the parity of the impact on individuals spied on, makes it all but impossible to distinguish the IPT's conclusions in many instances before this inquiry. Secondly, the MPS and the MPCC made significant concessions, which are applicable in this context too. But it's important to note that the IPT's findings are not confined to those concessions. They made additional findings. Thirdly, the IPT found that 2 managers in the NPOIU knew about Mark's sexual relationship, despite those managers and the MPS's denials of knowledge. As for other senior managers, the evidence was not clear enough to impute actual knowledge, but the IPT concluded that there was something akin to a don't ask, don't tell policy in the remainder of the unit. Whether that is also true of the SDS management is one of the issues, in my respectful submission, that this inquiry will have to address. Fourthly, the NPS's and the NPCC's argument that the deployment was necessary in a democratic society on the basis that, as they said, the intelligence provided allowed the police to provide a proactive and measured response to prevent crime and public disorder and to ensure the safety of the public and of those engaged in legitimate peaceful protest. That argument was rejected by the IPT, which concluded, on the contrary, that while the deployment of undercover officers to gather intelligence on serious criminality might justify some intrusion into people's lives, it would be unlikely that the test of proportionality and necessity would be satisfied in relation to policing protests generally or preventing public disorder. In my submission, that is a conclusion which has obvious relevance, not just to Article 8, but also to any attempts to justify trespass. The IPT also found that the actions of the undercover officers in gathering, recording, storing and transmitting information about Kate Wilson's political activities interfered with her Article 10 and 11 rights, as I've already mentioned. And since that is what the SDS did for thousands of individuals throughout the duration of its existence, again, those findings are of clear significance. It is also significant, I say, that neither the Commission nor the neither the MPS nor the MPCC appealed any of the findings in this judgment. Indeed, they accepted those findings. So, turning to police and security service powers in this relevant period. During the period covered by Tranche 1, 1968 to 1982, neither the police nor the security service had any statutory powers to conduct undercover surveillance. And that means that all the common law and human rights restrictions that I've been discussing applied squarely to their actions, just as they do to overt police action. Finally, in relation to the law, policing by consent. There is a tradition in this jurisdiction of something called policing by consent, which is expressed in 9 principles known as the Pelian Principles. And they were set out in general instructions issued to every new police officer from 1829 and remain the foundation for that tradition of policing by consent. And I've set some of those out in the written statement, but I just want to highlight one in particular, Principle 5, the principle in which officers were injuncted to maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence. And that underlines once again why the police must comply with the law in their actions. They are the public, just as the public are the police. And it also raises serious questions about the extent to which the police can properly trick other members of the public when carrying out their duties, unless given express permission to do so. So consideration of legality by the police. It's a striking feature of the evidence from Tranche 1, despite all this applicable law, that the common law and human rights of individuals and the impact on those rights of long-term undercover policing was rarely, if ever, considered. There's no evidence of that so far that we have seen, and it's not clear why that was. And I do suggest that that will be an important area of investigation. So in the written opening statement, we have summarised the evidence that has already been heard and presented, and I don't intend to repeat that now, but I do just want to highlight a couple of points. The evidence shows that there was no guidance or training on privacy concerns or intimate relationships. It shows that undercover officers were given free rein to decide how to run their own surveillance, and that tasking was usually broad brush, with no restriction on entering homes and no restriction on surveillance or on recording information. On the contrary, officers were expected to hoover up as much information as possible. No consideration was given to the welfare or privacy of those under surveillance. And overall, they reported very little crime, disorder, or intelligence about real risks to democracy. Often, the intelligence gathered showed an absence of any serious threats to public order. Managers were aware, the evidence shows, that there was a risk of undercover officers engaging in sexual relationships, but there was still no guidance on how on this issue. And finally, highlighting from the general points in our written statement, managers describe a practice of undercover officers maintaining their cover and misleading the court if arrested and prosecuted. So the position of the CAT-H core participants on all of this is that it is clear that inserting undercover police officers for long-term deployments into social and political groups meant that the police was closely monitoring, recording and influencing the lawful exercise of their fundamental democratic rights, including freedom of expression and political thought, that there was trespass into private lives, that women were exposed to inherent and discriminatory risks of degrading and abusive sexual relationships when it was the state's obligation to protect them from those risks, and that the police force was being corrupted by these practices and was betraying the public's trust and the values of truth, integrity, and honesty, which underpin law and order. By their willingness to lie to courts, for example, the police were attacking the very institutions which it was their duty to support. And it's plain that all of this was incompatible with the applicable contemporaneous standards of law, whether those standards were common law, administrative law, or international human rights law. All those sources of law spoke then and speak now with one voice on three basic principles. No general authorization may be given to the police or the security service to search individuals or property for evidence of wrongdoing. Secondly, police powers to trespass on land, property, and the person will only be lawful when necessary and proportionate to meet a pressing social need, such as prevention or investigation of serious crime or an imminent breach of the peace. And thirdly, that the use of covert powers by the police and the security service is itself a danger to democracy and subject to a particularly strict necessity test, both in terms of the seriousness of the threat said to justify it and the lack of any alternative method of meeting it. All of these basic principles were breached in CAT-H's, and that is CAT-H's position on the evidence and the law. So in relation to sexual relationships, it is obvious that the invasiveness of the undercover policing method was extreme, so that the invasion that was already present from trespassing in people's homes and private lives extended to their bodies and the intimacy of romantic relationships. So the MPS now disavows this as wrong, but it is important to be aware that the position of the police on this has not always been so clear. And we've highlighted this in our written statement, that the Commissioner at the time in 2012 told the Home Affairs Select Committee that the fact sexual relationships may sometimes happen in undercover work was almost inevitable. Now, Cat HCPs agree that abusive sexual relationships are an inevitable risk of long-term infiltration by undercover police officers. And that is yet another reason why the undercover tactic should be reserved for the most serious threats and crimes. And that every safeguard should be in place to prevent risks from occurring when used. None of this occurred for the duration of the SDS and the NPOIU. That is already, in my submission, clear. But the inevitability of this risk, as understood at the time, alongside the lack of any meaningful safeguards, does raise serious questions about the direct and or indirect involvement, knowledge and awareness of managers and other senior officers. And so in conclusion, the Cat HCPs make plain their view that what happened to them was the inevitable byproduct of an approach to undercover work, which was ill-conceived in policing terms because the end could not justify the risks entailed, which through lack of boundaries and supervision quickly spiraled out of control, which operated unaccountably in secret, and in which at all stages, minimal regard was had to the rights of and impact on members of the public. The evidence shows that the maintenance of the secrecy and integrity of the SDS and NPOIU's undercover operations swiftly became an end in itself, with constitutional principles that I've mentioned, the justice system, in other words, the courts, and the rights of members of the public coming second. So I wanted to briefly address next steps. In the circumstances that I've described, the Cat HCPs respectfully suggest that the starting point for the next phase of investigations must be that unless the pattern of undercover policing substantially deviates from that is already apparent for Tranche 1, it is already clear that the SDS's activities were unlawful and unjustified. And that must mean that the key question is how this managed to happen, given the hallowed principles of British democracy that were at stake, and the fact that senior police officers and ministers must have known about those principles, and why it lasted so long, and in particular survived reforms to police practices elsewhere, such as the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, the introduction of the Human Rights Act, and of course, REPA. Now, it nonetheless remains essential in order to fulfill the inquiry's terms of reference that the full extent of the wrongdoing in Tranche 1 is established and explored in the evidence of the managers and more senior officials. And we've suggested in our written statement a number of themes for exploration in that inquiry. And I think, sir, you've already put this to the police, but if the other core participants disagree, at least with the legal points that we've made underpinning our position, they should be asked to say why, because establishing the legal framework and any disagreements about it and its consequences would, we suggest, significantly assist in identifying and possibly narrowing issues under consideration. And it would also assist in identifying the scope of any further examination of the evidence. And we note in that regard that the police, the MPS and the designated lawyers have made a number of requests for new evidence, which you have rejected yesterday. But the CAT-H core participants suggest that in any event, the point at which to decide on whether such a request should be acceded to is after the legal framework and any relevant disputes about it have been established, because then it can properly be ascertained whether these requests will be relevant to any issue which the inquiry still needs to address. And my final point is to just highlight that in the written statement, the CAT-H core participants have made some points about Rule 9 questions and also disclosure. I'm not going to repeat them now, but that is not because they are not of a considerable importance to the Cat H call participants, but for time reasons. And I do ask that they be carefully considered, in particular the request for full and early disclosure of documents which record the activities of the undercover officers with whom they had sexual relationships, and more broadly, the police's surveillance of them and of the groups of which they are members. They have explained that waiting is a painful process for them, and also that they may be of assistance to the inquiry once that material is produced, will be of assistance to the inquiry. So, sir, unless there is anything else that I can address, that is my oral opening on behalf of the Cat H call participants.
Thank you. I'm plainly not going to respond in detail at the moment, but I would like, however, to say two things. First of all, I agree with you wholeheartedly that the legal framework for the conduct of undercover operations by a police unit is something that has to be determined and cannot be shirked. I do not intend to shirk it. Secondly, I'm afraid I must repeat the disappointment that I know that the Category H core participants have felt in telling them that I cannot, without utterly disrupting the orderly progress of the inquiry, ensure that they get everything before everybody else. I'm afraid they will have to wait their turn along with everybody else, although I do bear in mind, I'm well aware of the concern and worse that this causes to them as a result of having to wait. But I'm afraid it's unavoidable.
So, well, they will have heard what you have to say about it, and we have explained, why it is a particular problem for them. And I must reiterate on their behalf that it may engage the state's obligations under Articles 3, 8, and 14. And we have suggested in the written opening statement that the police themselves need to think carefully about the possible disclosure directly to these women, because it is wrong that they should be deprived of this material for so long when the police have, on their own admission, acted wrongly in relation to these women.
I can't answer on their behalf, but I'm afraid the answer that I've given you on behalf of the inquiry is simply unavoidable. It's not out of any wish to uphold a principle or anything of that kind. It's simply that we cannot do it, and that practical reason, I'm afraid, has to surmount any other consideration. If we can't do it, we can't. Now, you have further opening statements to make. Not. We're now 25 past. Would you like to start at 25 past 2?
I'm in your hands, sir. I mean, I will go as quickly. It will be quicker, obviously, the next two opening statements. So I'm in your hands whether we start early or at 25 past.
Well, I think it takes time to organise the courtroom, and everybody needs their lunch. And apart from anything, I personally would like to be able to listen carefully to what you have to say without having to worry about having bolted my lunch. We'll resume at 25 past. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.